Jesus, a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, called us to preach good news to the poor. And when religion is used to camouflage meanness, we know that we have a heart problem in America. I say to you tonight that some issues are not left versus right or liberal versus conservative. They are right versus wrong. When we love the Jewish child and the Palestinian child, the Muslim and the Christian and the Hindu and the Buddhist and those who have no faith, but they love this nation. We are reviving the heart of our democracy. Let me be clear that she nor any person can do it alone. The watchword of this democracy and the watchword of faith is we. In this season, when some want to harden and stop the heart of our democracy, we are being called, like our foremothers and fathers, to be the moral defibrillators of our time. We can't give up on the heart of our democracy, not now, not ever. Stand up, vote together, organize together, fight for the heart of this nation. And while you're fighting, sing that old hymn, revive us again, fill each heart with thy love. May each soul be rekindled with fire from above.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. As the world careens from one seemingly endless and more intense crisis to another, many have developed a moral amnesia and psychological numbness to the human vulnerability and fragility in and around us. We seem unaware and incapable of having rational discourses on power, privilege, and position. The ways incredible disparities play themselves out between privileged in-groups and exclusion and oppression of out-groups. We seem blind and oblivious not only to the traumas, exclusion, and violence being carried out on those who are excluded from experiences of belonging, but to the re-traumatizing impact and damage it has done to us all. The largest and most immediate risk to human survival are the wars and genocides of violent exclusion, by means of which we now have the power to destroy all life on Earth. Our guests today on the Radical Imagination are John Adlam and Christopher Scanlon. In their brilliant new book, Psychosocial Explorations of Trauma, Exclusion, and Violence, they speak about the psychosocial dynamics in ways to promote social inclusion without perpetuating social exclusion. Following the 2,500-year-old protest paradigm of the Athenian philosopher Diogenes, they search with their intellectual lens and lamp for that one honest man who understands that the only truthful position available in relation to the world is the one that is neither in nor out. Diogenes stands with and for our present day socially excluded, the homeless, the displaced, the truant, the starved, the addicted, the antisocial, all those who are in the unhoused state of mind, literally and or metaphorically, as we and they face the formal structures of the social world. John Adlam is consultant adult forensic psychotherapist at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London and is a founding member of the Association for Psychosocial Studies. He's an independent researcher who has published widely on the psychosocial dynamics of homelessness, dangerousness, disorder, and social exclusion, and on working in and with traumatized teams in traumatized organizations. Christopher Scanlon is a psychotherapist in adult and forensic mental health and works extensively with complex psychosocial processes of traumatization and inclusion/exclusion in groups, neighborhood organizations, and social institutions. He too is a founding member of the Association for Psychosocial Studies. So welcome, John and Chris. It is so great to have you here and to discuss this incredible new book that you have that's just coming out. And again, welcome to the Radical Imagination.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you.
Well, I have so many questions for you, but let me start. Help our audience literally understand your titles, how it relates to the British mental health system, especially in terms of the phrasing in groups and out groups, marginalized, oppressed persons, the sense of belonging, as you describe them in the book. Give us an understanding to our American audience here about what you all are involved in.
Wow, who's going to go first?
John, go ahead. Well, whoever wants to.
Go ahead, John.
I mean, I think the first thing we'd want to say is that in emphasizing kind of the status of independent researchers, we're positioning ourselves in relation to a mental health system rather than necessarily wanting to be completely inside it. Although in the book we acknowledge, I hope fully, that we are nonetheless part of the systems that we're critiquing. The British mental health system is still based around the National Health Service, constituted after World War II, increasingly and creepingly and covertly privatized, but still free at the point of access. And I still work as a psychotherapist in the NHS, in specialist services, in forensic services for offenders with mental health difficulties, and in outpatient services for people with complex needs. But I'm quite a rare breed as a psychotherapist in the NHS, as a lay psychotherapist, neither psychiatrist nor psychologist, and my core training is as a group psychotherapist.
I see. How do people come to see you, to interact with you?
Well, in the forensic settings, I'm afraid it's not voluntary. They're detained patients. In the outpatient services, there's an NHS referral system to sort of get into the programs that I work on. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think in this evening we're also kind of wearing non-aligned and independent hats as well as those sort of different roles. Chris, I don't know if you want to add to what I said. But...
What I would add in terms of the question is that there's something also about our work and the way in which we're framing it, which is about working with people that don't want to be worked with. So the question of them coming to see us with some motivation to change in a way is well, that would be a luxury. By the time they've been worked with to such an extent that they feel that there's something of value or something to be gained by speaking about their troubles. In a way, a huge part of the work has already been done, and part of that work, I think, is about trying to work in those places where the motivation and the traumatization processes and the damage is so extreme that there is no particular trust, there is no particular motivation, and yet the system and the workers are tasked with trying to sort of reach into those places to try and engage people whose fear and anxiety and terror and terrorizingness, if you hold that word, is such that they don't want anything to do with the likes of us for all sorts of very, very sensible reasons. So so part of the process is how do we get from a place where someone has so much identified by being a member of the outgroup, or are so much seen as a member of the outgroup, that they're not the sort of people for whom services are generally available, at least with the invitation for them to come in on their own terms. If they're going to come in, they're going to come in on our terms, one way or the other. And of course, that level of coercion is very difficult. So part of the work that we've been writing about over the years is about engaging with, for instance, complex processes of traumatization in relation to people who are street homeless, addicted and damaged and abused, and in all sorts of ways, who really don't want to come in from the cold, and or those people who have been forcibly brought in from the cold and put in even colder places, such as prisons and psychiatric hospitals,
Right.
where they're there really because there's a sense in which they're troublesome to the in-group, rather than the in-group wants to offer them any help. So in a way, what they're offered is to make us, the in-group, feel better, rather than any particular offer to them as the out-group. We can all feel, the mythology is we'll all sleep safer in our beds if some of these people are either ignored or put somewhere safe behind high walls, and then we can forget about them. And there is something about this level of, inhumanity, you might say, which is what we're trying to speak to. So, it's people that don't want it, and of course, then how do you engage the people that find themselves in those places is terrifically challenging. So a lot of the work that I do at the moment is mainly trying to work with those people who are tasked with reaching out to those people, many of whom are the least valued of our professional staff.
Yeah. Well, forced rehabilitation, in a sense. It's interesting. Before you came on, Chris, I was showing John a book that I was using as a graduate student, Nicholas Kittrey, The Right to Be Different, Deviance and Enforced Therapy. Now, tell me a little bit. Of course, the States, we've gone through our period of deinstitutionalization to a certain extent, both in mental hospitals, certainly in mental hospitals, and some would argue many of those same people found their way into our prison institutionalization system. But tell me about that in England. Are there other vehicles through which these people are could be seen, non-institutionalized? Organizations, vehicles, resources that you might have there in the country?
I think if speaking, as it were, from the voice of the book, we want to be careful about these other people. Some of us might find ourselves on the streets and picking our way through charitable or statutory, possibly picking through and avoiding many of those provisions. As Chris has already said, if trust has collapsed, then the offer of inclusion is already a suspect one. So on one level, I'd want to say resources in this country are, I don't know how to compare them exactly with resources in other countries, but there are resources, but they come with their own terms and conditions and small print. Come in from the cold, as long as you fit the bill, or bite back what you're thinking of saying. But I think we'd want to say that there go any of us. So, and I think we'd also want to say that the kind of processes, not limited to England or Britain or Europe, but kind of global, planetary Gaia processes of climate disaster, of racism, of human mobility, that may speak to none of us being quite as settled as we might like to think we are, and this othering of the unsettled being, in some ways, if it's possible to say, even more toxic than it has been in the past.
Right.
Yeah, I would sort of tease your question out a little differently, I think, and there's something about the way in which mental health services, I think in the UK that's a misnomer. I mean, they're not mental health services at any stretch of the imagination. They're mental illness services. So the idea that there's a promoting of health and mental health in any sort of meaningful epidemiological or social way, I think is pretty absent. So that part of the way in which you get in to any offer of help is to go along with a voice that says there's something wrong with you, and very often I think that's a sort of victim blaming mentality. So that in a way, why are poor, disenfranchised, poverty-stricken, unemployed people depressed? Isn't because they haven't sufficient psychological resilience or any notions of that. It's because of the socioeconomic systems that keeps them poor. So that very often I think that the psychological offering is we would suggest is perverse in perhaps not necessarily in a psychoanalytic way, but perverse in the sense that they're sort of psychological solutions to social problems and political problems, and in that sense, it's a sticking plaster to a much deeper and more serious problem, the problem of inclusion, exclusion, poverty, unemployment, racism, the differentials between the rich and the poor, that are crippling, and that's before we then start to widen it out, as John's already suggested, about the differences, between the Western world or the global North, or however you want to think about it, and those people that suffer similarly in other places, for whom you would see, well, when there's not even a psychological offer, there's no offer whatsoever. But I think there's something about that perversity of offering a psychological solution to sociological or social or political problems, and the imagining by the system that that's going to work is very damaging. So, for instance, as an example, John and I both worked in a therapeutic community, which was state-funded for people with very complex, long-standing childhood histories of trauma and deprivation, often very articulate, intelligent, creative people, but very damaged by their experience. It was a qualitative, in-depth, group-based residential facility that was invested in hugely by bits of the system. It had a tradition and history over 60 years of being effective by any measure of scientific effectiveness and efficacy, but was closed down more or less at the same time that a government initiative called Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, IAPT, which was a government initiative, was on the rise, which was set up actually by an economist who was at the time saying, people don't want to take the jobs because they're depressed, and so if we offer them some psychological intervention, they'll be less depressed, and so they'll take the jobs. Not noticing at the time and now that there weren't any jobs for them to take. So it became a massive sort of cover-up of what was really going on. And all of the IAP services were short-term. They were often on the telephone. They were often sort of offering, people over the telephone with a manualized offering by often by young practitioners who don't have the training, and if they did, they couldn't offer anything anyway. And that this was deemed to be the political offer. So very short-term psychological interventions by relatively untrained people for very serious problems. And of course, the only thing that achieved was to create more patients, because the people who were working in that system burned out in huge numbers and became themselves stressed and unwell because the level of support and infrastructure to support them doing that difficult work wasn't there, because it's simple, really. You just, someone rings you up and you offer them some platitudes and they'll be grateful and go away, which of course they're not, and it doesn't. So, so I'm a bit down on the mental health.
I can tell. Listen,
realistically, I hope.
Depressing story. It's got to be very depressing for you, both of you. You're put in this impossible situation of offering custodial care for people that a lot more could be done. And as an excuse, the system's been set up so that it doesn't sound like it. Same here too, by the way. So it doesn't have to deal with these underlying structural issues, structural violence, poverty, the enormous inequalities, and so on. And I can see why you wanted so much to write this book and really ventilate about this.
But furthermore, I think, also just one other thing is that it also, I think, blames the victim. It makes them responsible for their plight. If you're unhappy and miserable and you become psychotic or unwell, it's somehow because of the inner workings of your mind. It's nothing to do with the organization of the communities, or the lack of organization in the communities, the neighborhoods in which you live, or the invitation for the people who are more enfranchised and have more money to pay more taxes to pay for better services. It's nothing to do with that. It's blaming, it's victim blaming,
and perpetuating people in it. And I'm assuming that those who can afford it are able to get the private care and the therapy as they are here. And so what you're talking about is large segments. How many people, that's a good question, I think we need to answer. How many people are you talking about here that fit into these institutions in England? Well, how many people are we talking about generally? We know, of course, we're talking about millions of people, 2.5 million people in our prison system, for example. So how many people are we talking in American prison system? So give us an idea of how many people we're talking about in England, Britain.
I don't feel I've got. I don't have those numbers.
Wow. Okay.
I think
a lot.
Our governments like to build prisons. Certainly, a number of those trends go back and forth across the Atlantic. Governments are less keen on more equal interventions. So it's more. I think I'd more be able to say something about kind of proportions than about numbers. Chris and I both live in South London, in where the populations are racially diverse. I think diversity in these boroughs is very broad. London has a kind of melting pot representation, South London particularly so, and we would want to celebrate that, and then we'd want to lament and be horrified at the disproportion of people of colour, of Black and ethnic minority origins and cultures who are subjected to the more coercive interventions. So that would be some part of an answer without going into numbers would be about the proportions of black and brown bodies on the wards being nursed in under-resourced circumstances by black and brown bodies of the nursing staff, while the likes of me kind of come and go and give of their wisdom and occasionally see a patient, and but it's on our behalves that this happens. And I think we could say maybe on both sides of the Atlantic, but certainly here, that ever since the sort of neoliberal turn from the mid-70s and sort of propelled in with the advent of Thatcher and Reagan, distress has been privatized into the clinic rather than taken seriously in the public spaces and forums of our societies. So let's hive it off and shut it off, be it on the analyst's couch or in the NHS clinic or in the high secure facility. Psychosocially dislocated distress is being privatized, as if it was, as Chris has already said, a problem in the mind of in the mind and personality and constitution and attitude of the member of the outgroup in question, but also as increasingly a technocratic transaction.
Dumping grounds. These sound like dumping grounds for the human refuse that the society has decided to throw out from its midst. Chris, we have this taped an hour later than usual because you were. Tell us what you were doing. You were running a group. Just give our audience an idea of what you've been doing the past hour or so before you came on the show. Who are you seeing? How are you operating?
Well, the group that I was working with just before I came on, was a group I've been working with for a long time, and that is a sort of a low-cost private psychotherapy group, and that's the best sort of bit of my week. But earlier in the day, I was working with some psychologists working into the prison system, where talking about their experiences of significant and extreme fear in relation to what seems to be beginning to happen as the prison service opens up after the COVID pandemic, because I think it may be similar in other bits of the world, but one of the things that's happened in the UK is that panic and inconsistency and disorganization set in the prison system, the solution to which was to lock everybody up in their cells for 20 to 23 hours a day for about 2 years, with occasional trips to the shower or the toilet or to get a meal in a particular queue. And of course, there was no planning or thinking about the organisation of that and what might need to happen, when the pandemic abates. And it certainly is the case that I think that some of the people who are beginning to express their extreme annoyance and irritation and anger about the way that the people in Britain have been treated recklessly by this government are the people who are perhaps a little more impulsive, a little bit more reckless, a little bit more angry, locked up and locked down. And I think it's the beginning. To my mind, what I was thinking earlier today is it feels a bit like the canary in the coal mine, if you have that, if you follow that expression. And there's something about the first sign of the people in Britain beginning to sort of realise what's been going on in this country over the last while. And the group that I was in just before coming here, I think, was a group of people. They're all working in the system, practitioners of one sort or another. And so what I was trying to do was think about how to understand that from a psychosocial perspective. And so partly, this question about what are the politics of psychotherapy, in the politics of what's been happening, links into that. I've lost my train of thought slightly, but there's something about 150, getting on for 160,000 people have died in the last 2 years as a result of the negligence and the neglect of the in-group, carelessly, for some of the most vulnerable and some of the most excluded members of the out-group. And certainly those in the prison are beginning to recognize something about the way that they've been treated and are very cross about it.
I was going to ask you, Chris, are you seeing acts of resistance? And also, John, I mean, are there hunger strikes? Are there any outward violent rebellions and so on?
Well, I think at the moment, what I'm seeing, but I think it's often the sort of the way that it begins, isn't it? Is that the violence that I'm hearing about? There is some violence towards staff in the prison system and in the hospital system. In the prison system, it seems much more that the fights, and there are lots of fights I've been hearing about, and the distress is being enacted between the prisoners, in a sense. And in a way, as long as it's been acted between the prisoners, the system is sort of a bit content with that. The divide and rule strategy. As long as they're fighting each other, they're not fighting us, the in-group. But I think at some point, there may well be, and one could almost hope for it, coming together of people that are otherwise fighting each other in society and prison or wherever they are, gangs or whatever we want to think about, beginning to realize that the other gang isn't actually the person that's causing them to be hurt and marginalized and distressed so much as the people in charge. And I think if that realization does begin to set in, then I think that the protests and the will follow. The question is, who will get there first? Will the right get that first?
How do you finesse this? Both of you, John. I mean, this has got to come up in your interaction with your patients here. I mean, how do you finesse? I mean, I won't get too academic. I mean, you talk about class consciousness, the class struggle in a sense. We just had a couple of weeks ago, we had Chris Hedges on, and he's been teaching a course at Rahway State Prison for the last 13 years. And one of the things that happened out of that course, one of the first courses he taught, was they produced a play called Caged. So it's obviously he had to be careful about all this too, but that energy got channeled in a creative way. I mean, how do you deal with these people? How many of them are medicated, for example? Would you say the great proportion of people that you're working with, are they on psychotropic drugs?
In the prisons, you mean?
Yeah, in the groups that you're working with.
And I would say the minority are, because in a way to prescribe medication is to care a bit.
Really?
I think it is more as a picture of just utter disinterest, and I mean, one of the debates that's very lively, I think, in the prison bit at the moment is that one of the things that the custodial bits of the system, the people in charge of security and discipline, have discovered or think they've discovered, is that it's much easier to manage the prison when everybody is locked up and locked down, because the drug trade and the bullying and the intimidation, there's a lot less of it because people are behind their doors. But what you were saying earlier, you were saying about rehabilitation, there is no meaningful rehabilitation. So that what we do know is that people that go into prison and are treated in these sorts of ways come out more resentful and angry than they went in, and reoffend, and perhaps reoffend in more violent ways. So that the short-term solution, long them up, lock them up, bang them up, and hope for the best, I think reflects the the political cycle. If the government can get away with not spending any money for 4 years, and then gets to the next generation, gets re-elected, and so on, there's no incentive to spend any money in the system whatsoever, because it would involve increased taxation. It would involve, offering something to people that are deemed to be undeserving, or spending money on people that are deemed to be undeserving or unworthy.
So no real political will in the country for that as well, is what you're saying.
No.
So as well.
No. I think it reflects, and I think it reflects also the other theme of the book. A major theme of the book is the subtitle is about unhoused minds and inhospitable environments. And I think one of the other things that links to this, story as a metaphor, mental health system as metaphor, I mean, it's very real, is that the parallel is also in the way in which fences and barriers are erected around asylum seekers and refugees and people who are fleeing real traumatic situations or real poverty in other places, drowning in the Mediterranean, being turned back in the English Channel and drowning in the English Channel because we don't want them here either. So there's a whole sense in which there's all sorts of people that we would include in this outgroup, rather than just, as it were, those identified as having behavioural problems.
That's a very important point, right? The psychosocial dynamics, correct, are not just we're not just talking about a specific institution here, but worldwide. And so, why I must ask you? You talk about the Diogenes paradigm. Why do you use that in the book, John? Maybe you can tell us.
So
audience understand.
Yes. So there's the story. Which should I give a one line, sort of a 2-line summary of the story?
Yeah, a little bit.
So Diogenes of Sinope. He is an exile, a man in exile, a migrant. He's left Sinope because he's got in trouble with the law. He makes his way to ancient Greece. This is, as you say, 500 years ago, and he sort of finds his way into the kind of main square of the Greek cities. There's some stories set in Athens, some stories set in Corinth, but he takes up his place in the agora, in the public spaces, in his barrel. And everyone says, Diogenes, you can hang out there. You're not a citizen, but you can sort of be in your barrel. We'll leave you alone. But Diogenes doesn't exactly kind of want to be left alone either, because he gets out of his barrel and he goes kind of pestering people, and he's a sort of manic street preacher. He kind of bears down upon you with his stick and berates you for your kind of conformity to sort of bourgeois democratic ideology, and makes a general nuisance of himself on his own terms, because he just doesn't respect, in the profound sense, he doesn't accept the authority of the authorities to tell him what to do. And so Alexander the Great, to compress the story immensely, Alexander the Great is the most powerful figure in the ancient world. Is intrigued, hears about this guy, goes down, does a bit of outreach to the homeless man in his kind of in his bash, as it gets called sometimes in this country, in his barrel, and starts chatting to Diogenes, and sort of finds him quite impressive. Gosh, you're homeless, but you're quite impressive. And in the end says, well, look, can we do anything? It must be uncomfortable in there with your dogs and your defecation and your masturbation and your public displays of unseemliness. Why don't you? We'll get you a place. Right, you could be one of us. And Diogenes says, there is one thing you could do, old man. You're blocking my light. Could you just get out of the sun? And this is we retell this story time and again, but we represent this story as a paradigmatic moment of an encounter between the all-powerful, irresistible force of the in-group and the authorities and the establishment and empire, and the immovable object of the out-group that doesn't accept or the authority or the terms of the offer.
Yeah.
So Diogenes is just not impressed.
Right.
Because Alexander's actually got nothing that he wants. But more than that, the challenge is what then does Alexander do? What then does the system of care do? How might we reimagine the in-group's response? Because Alexander does do quite a cool thing, and he doesn't just torch the barrel and march Diogenes off to the slave ships. He stands aside, but he keeps the channel open. And so, and any person doing outreach work with the homeless would understand that moment of, well, yeah, I'm going to step out of your light because I respect that that's your right to insist on that. But I'm just not going to completely disappear. I'm not going to wash my hands of you totally here. I'm going to keep a channel open, and maybe we can sort of start a conversation, and maybe something can come of it. Okay, so that's a very compressed version of the ancient myth as we retell it. But I began my career in working with people, working in homelessness services, in cold weather shelters, in voluntary organisations providing Christmas shelter, that kind of outreaching. And as Chris and I has already mentioned, that Chris and I worked at the Henderson Hospital Democratic Therapeutic Community. We started to think together while we were working there about the difficulties of consulting to people who might be going towards the therapeutic community and saying, well, you could come in from the cold, but these are the terms of the offer. No one-to-one therapy, everything's in groups. You might be woken up in the middle of the night for a community meeting. You've got to go away from your home territory, if not your home, because you might not have a home, but you have to go a long way and hole up in South London for a year and do this intensive work. And we started to realize, I'm slightly speaking for Chris here, but I think the point is we started to sort of think about what a mad offer that was. Not that it was a bad offer, because if you could get yourself to the door of the Henderson, there was something transformative potentially there. But a mad sounding offer, certainly, a dubious offer, an offer that had more power in it than it pretended. And we started to think about the Diogenes story as a lens through which to explore these encounters across power differentials between systems of care, experiencing systems of care that experience the other, the outsider, the patient, if you must, as problematically refusing the offer. There's Alexander with his kind offer, hey, I'll get you a flat. There's Diogenes appearing to refuse the offer rather than not to accept the authority or the terms of the offer. And so the Diogenes story started to, we felt, helpfully illuminate these encounters on a micro and a macro scale, because the starving anorectic sufferer is construed as refusing his food. But that's because the keen offerer of good in-group sustenance thinks he's got some good food to offer and is a bit annoyed that it isn't refused, as any parent will tell you.
Let me ask you, let me just play it this way. What if, in fact, that in-group did offer that good food and top-notch psychiatric service, and at the same time, let's just think we're in the best of all possible worlds, work on some of the social, structural, political, economic disparities as well? Would you have a problem with that?
Well, that I think you're conscious of that being a multiple hypothetical.
Yeah. Right.
But I think so. I think we want to say the in-group does make these occasional offers that certainly look good to the in-group, and occasionally look good to members of the out-group. And at the individual level of someone's story, I can tell you stories of people who are homeless and now are not homeless, and there's nothing to invalidate that transaction, and Chris and I are both group psychotherapists. We both have low fee private practice psychotherapy groups. We make these offers. We're not too conflicted if they're accepted, although I think we probably try to be alert to the transaction at the point where the offer is made and accepted. But the quality, the first thing that the system of care needs to do is stop constructing a no as a problematic, disordered and pathological refusal, and start thinking about why there might be a problem with accepting the invitation. And that, I think in that regard, just briefly to say, disorder, you mentioned disorder in the introduction, and kind of we've written about disorder. Some disorder as a word appears in some of the titles of our papers, but disorder is always projected downwards.
Yeah.
So you were asking, well, are the prisoners kicking off yet? And that's where one, as it were, looks for the disorder, or the street homeless that kind of pester you like Diogenes on your way to the tube station. There's disorder out there somehow, and I suppose we're inviting at that point. The Diogenes paradigm helps us make the invitation to look upwards in search of the disorder, because Alexander, of course, is in all sorts of ways constructed as a hero and a civilized giant, and a man before his time, the most powerful man ever. He's a successful psychopath, really, and his idea of a cosmopolitan universe is just to conquer all the territories. So maybe we should look at that disorder a little.
And exactly, shift the narrative to those who are creating the structural inequalities. That's what you're talking about. Absolutely. And
with underlining that is us, so that we can't say these other people who are creating the structural inequalities.
Right. We use them as a scapegoat to avoid doing that. And you have this incredible quote here from James Baldwin, equating this in racial terms too. And you talk a lot about in the book, white privilege, white male privilege in particular. Well, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an unmovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. This is, in a sense, what needs to happen. Correct? By the entire structure. Does this begin with the out group and its allies, as you and you too, for example?
I don't. I mean, I think there's maybe answers to that, or not answers, but there may be responses to that are about what you might do. But I think there's also something about projecting equality into a future. So let's work towards a world in which everybody's equal, and that people respect each other and so on. And I think the narrative changes, and maybe this is a bit, what the quote was getting at in one way is, if you change the narrative and say, actually, what you might not have noticed is all human beings are equal to start with.
Yeah.
And then realize what's in the way of noticing that very, very obvious thing. Because as long as we are imagining that there's some of us can do something for someone else, then in a way we perpetuate the narrative that that some of us are different to others in significant ways, other than brutality and violence and so on. But if we start just with a thought experiment that we're all actually, everybody is equal in value and rights to start with, and that something has gone very, very, very wrong. Then we could probably all cohere around a different starting point to the one we've got at the moment, which is a sense, well, if we gradually work towards change in this way or that way, then we're working towards something desirable. Well, yes, but we're also wanting to think, well, let's start from the premise that everyone is equal to start with. And I think that the majority of people we're construing as the in group, or indeed for that matter the out group, don't actually start in that place, which is what the system has done to us, if you see what I mean. The system
I totally see what you're saying. I really think it's a very important way you're putting this. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
And then, of course, you can ask questions, what might you do differently? And certainly, in terms of the prison system, if you were to look at some of the other countries across the world, European countries, where there is more of, but not necessarily the right amount of rehabilitation, re-education, psychotherapy, engagement, rather than what I think is much more the British, and I would imagine the American system, from my reading of the American system, that's based really on an idea of punishment and retribution, rather than restoration and conversation and understanding why a criminal enacts our crimes, if you see what I mean. They enact crime, if you like, from within the group that we are all members of. They're enacting something on our behalf that we don't actually know how to speak to them about. So that the behavioural disturbance is better thought of as a disturbance of communication. We just don't know how to speak to one another, and so there are various enactments and various ways. And so part of the book is trying to sort of suggest rather simplistically, one might imagine, but in a very complex ways, how do we find ways together to talk about things that are of importance? And one of the things that certainly I think has motivated me, and I know John, but I speak for myself, to do something at this point, is because there's also always been an idea, I think, particularly in the privileged in-group, is, well, yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it all makes sense. Yeah, and we'll work towards it gradually, and we'll get there in the end, and all of that. Meanwhile, the world, the climate, the planet, is on the edge of destruction. The tipping point at which human life as we know it is seriously threatened. Is that moment, where in the book, is that moment where you go, aha, whoops, didn't notice that. And at the point at which we might wake up to it, as Baldwin was indicating, it probably is already too late. Certainly when you think about the wider problems about human migration and the attitude of the in-group to the migrants, that if someone is migrating from a place that is, for instance, severely affected by drought, rather than human rights violations as defined by asylum seeking or refugee seeking, they're construed as economic migrants in some sort of way, rather than, well, actually there's something pretty damn traumatizing and frightening about not having enough water.
Absolutely. And in the minute or so that we have left, because I think you put it very nicely just now and also in the book, how do you reclaim the agora, as you put it, and your anti-oppressive practices, your passion, as you put it, the professional and transdisciplinary communities of practice and learning? We've got to start somewhere. I also, I'm just reading a book with Angela Davis that just wrote, you might be familiar with that too, Abolition, Feminism, Now. And so we don't have, as you were saying, for many moments to go here. This has got to happen. And I really, unfortunately, we're over time already. I thank you so very much, both of you, for writing such an important book. And I really, bottom of my heart, hope that it gets wide readership. It really needs to be heard, and not only in your country, all around the world, and certainly in America as well. So thank you both very, very much for doing what you're doing and writing what you're doing, and try to keep up with your work and it's be of good spirits. Try to be of as good spirits as possible.
We're trying to go along with stuff less and get out a little bit more.
Absolutely. So thank you again, both, very, very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And thank you all so very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
So again, it's a question of whether you're in this for purification,
right,
or you're in this with a tragic understanding that all nations' founding was polluted. All nations were founded by polluting forces, forces that committed crimes. Period. There is no clean hands in the actual world. There are no clean hands. So if once you get into the iconoclastic mood of ripping the faces off the people you disapprove of, you leave a lot of rubble. And what you don't leave is a viable political or social order. What you leave is an impossible ambition that serves only, I think, the power lust, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged, of those people who believe that they are the sole custodians of purity, of excellence, of acceptability. Nations are founded in bloodshed. And none of this is to say anything in favor of Christopher Columbus or George Washington, but it's the same thing if we're looking at the founding of the nation, the nations of Brazil or of Colombia or Argentina, of Chile. The Spanish Empire became 21 or 22 states, and the founding of all of them was genocidal. What are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with that? Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to that question.